Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Lamont, and welcome to NYO Canada Online Workshops. Our YouTube live chat is open, and we will be fielding questions throughout the workshop, so please feel free to post any comments, questions, as well as chat amongst each other. Today, I am very excited to introduce today's presenter, who is a named member of the Order of Canada, as well as the Executive Director of Orchestras Canada. Please welcome Catherine Carleton.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a complete delight to be here, and it brings me fond memories of the summer of 2004 when I had the fun of working on the summer team for National Youth Orchestra of Canada and traveling with the orchestra from Victoria to Montreal and a host of places in between. It's always a privilege to be asked to do anything by the NYOC, whether as a musician, which I know people on the line will recognize, but also as someone who cares deeply about the current state and the future of Canadian orchestras. So thank you so much. I should also start by acknowledging that I am living and working in the traditional lands of the Mississauga Anishinaabe people in the city now known as Peterborough, Ontario. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we come together at a time of great stress for people around the world as we consider the impact of anti-Black racism. And just take a moment to make those acknowledgements and think about what they mean for us and the work that we do. Okay. So I've organized this session today with a lot of words on a PowerPoint deck, but I'm very much hoping that we can turn this into something quite interactive and with hot debate and discussion throughout the session and following. So we'll simply start by saying that my topic is Orchestra's New Normal, Canada's orchestras before, during, and after COVID-19. And we'll move on to the next slide, please. So I am Executive Director of Orchestras Canada. I've been here since 2005, something that's rather shocking to me. What is Orchestras Canada? We're the National Association for Canadian Orchestras, and our mission is to help orchestras achieve together what they cannot accomplish alone, serving Canadian orchestras in both official languages through research, knowledge sharing, convening, and advocacy. The most important part of that mission, as far as I'm concerned, is the business about helping orchestras do together what they cannot do as independent local businesses. That we always look for the sweet spot where collaboration is possible and where it will have the greatest impact. Next slide. We're probably most famous amongst performing musicians for our job board. We are the recognized place to put job postings for roles in professional orchestras across Canada, mostly performance roles, but also administration. We run a national conference most years, as well as workshops. We do an annual comparative report that gets financial and audience information from orchestras right across the country. We also do other kinds of research. Currently, we're involved in an international study on COVID-19 transmission and wind instruments, and other things that I'll perhaps address a little bit later. We do advocacy, and principally with the federal government, but our focus is absolutely on making the case for the value that orchestras bring to community and the kinds of policy and the kinds of investment that they need to stay strong. We also do a lot of work on information exchange and perspective between peer orchestras across the country. And I'll also say that we see ourselves as sort of a confidant and resource for people right across the community. Next slide. About me, I have a Bachelor of Music degree in performance from the University of Toronto an extremely long time ago. Master's in management. I did my major paper at McGill on happiness in orchestras, which I think is a grotesquely understudied topic. I've worked as a clarinetist, teacher, academic administrator, granting officer, orchestra operations and programming leader, and as an orchestra manager in Toronto, Kitchener-Waterloo, Mississauga, Kingston, Halifax. As I mentioned before, I've been executive director of OC for 15 years and was appointed to the Order of Canada in 2016. Next slide. So in terms of Canadian orchestras, it's a remarkably diverse group. We've got 130 member orchestras. They're in every province. They're all sizes and types. They represented $220 million in spending in 1819. trending towards financial health, net balanced financial position across 71 of the largest orchestras. So anything you hear about the impending death of orchestras is at least delayed a bit. They're holding their own. 2.8 million bums in seats and part of a 58.9 billion arts and culture industry in Canada. Next slide. So I talked about the range of orchestras. Largest budget orchestra that's part of Orchestras Canada is the Orchestre Symphonique de Montréal. Annual revenues in 1819 of 37 million. Smallest budget orchestra, this is my favorite. They wouldn't even tell us what the number was. They just proudly said, our revenues were in 4 figures last year. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether that was $1,000 or $9,999. But as I say, you can absolutely see that there's a range there. What's the difference? Mostly it's simply got to do with the number of professional musicians that they engage, the number of concerts they put on, and those things tend to be calibrated to the size and the wealth of the community, the amount of competition that they potentially face. In terms of revenues, this is the pattern from 1819, 35.8% earned, that means from ticket sales as well as sold services. 40.2% contributed, and that's a combination of individual philanthropy, foundations, special fundraising events, and sponsorships, and 24% from government. Now, these are aggregate national figures. They don't recognize the great differences between provinces. One of the things that we absolutely see is that the provincial government in the province of Quebec is extraordinarily generous to culture and the arts. And so we see much higher numbers from government in that province, lower numbers in other jurisdictions across the country. In terms of expenses, 51.1% artistic, 48.9% on other, but overall about 80% of orchestra's expenses are all about paying people to do things. Next slide. So in terms of jobs in Canadian professional orchestras, I turn to the Bible of how people are paid. And the Bible is called Wage Scales and Conditions in the Symphony Orchestra. Most recent edition is the 1718 year. It's published by Symphonic Services of the Canadian Federation of Musicians. And it is sort of an annual evisceration of the working terms and conditions in collective bargaining agreements signed by professional Canadian orchestras. And this particular report covers 21 of the largest Canadian orchestras, and it's a very valued, if sometimes depressing, document. Next slide, please. What do we learn? Guess what? Pay range in professional Canadian orchestras covered in that report. Annual revenues between $5,217 for one orchestra up to $91,448. And this is base pay for a section player in one of those orchestras. So you can see that there is quite the range. Expressed as a per service rate, it's anywhere between $81.55 per service up to $248.50 per service. Next slide. The other things that we can take a look at here are things like the level of pension contributions. Canadian orchestral musicians have access to the Musicians' Pension Fund of Canada, which is a really well-run pension fund, and only the engagers or employers can contribute to it. So this is money that is contributed by the orchestras to help ensure that their musicians have a safe and secure retirement. It'll also cover things like per diems and travel payments, covers tax status of musicians, whether they're treated as employees or independent contractors. And there's also language around job security, how long it takes to get tenure, what the procedures are for getting tenure, what role your peers play in determining whether or not you get tenure. Moving forward. Next slide. Looking at this document, it caused me to ask a number of questions. Just sort of thinking about quality of life and who you are and who you want to be as a performing musician. What rhythm and pace of work is best for you? Where do your talents best fit? And what else do you want to fit into your life? And knowing a number of professional musicians as I do, and as I know you all do as well, interesting questions about the extent to which their work with their orchestra provides them with a nonstop source of delight, and the times when, in fact, it's a very stressful role, a very lonely role, and one that may actually cut them off from some of the other things that they love to do. So I always find it interesting to say, what, other than the fact that you want a job, what kind of job? Where do you want to work? And what do you want to be doing as your major creative outlet? Next slide. So I'm borrowing some characteristics of a successful orchestral musician from Diana Haskell, who's a co-principal clarinetist in the St. Louis Symphony. And Diana describes characteristics of actually it's successful members of her studio, but I think that they translate into the professional realm as well. Mature, persistent, and resilient, honest, courageous, humble, thoughtful, possesses a sense of humor. Something else that I would probably throw in there, although it might be included in the humble part, is, are you willing to put yourself at the service of your colleagues? And to what extent are you prepared to be a servant leader within the context of the orchestra? Not just playing on time in tune, but also getting involved in orchestra committees, advising, whether it's advising administration or taking care of quality of life issues for your peers around the table. But I think these are all great things. I will make a note about the sense of humor piece, that sometimes the best thing about a sense of humor is to know when to use it and when to keep your mouth shut. Next slide, please. I'm now going to move into some controversial statements about life and work in symphony orchestras. This one is courtesy of the American composer Gunther Schuller, who in 1980 at Tanglewood said, musicians in symphony orchestras are embittered, disgruntled, and bored. They've come to hate music, are apathetic and cynical. They have no spiritual identification with the scores they play. I think that is one of the saddest statements I've read, and yet it gets worse. Next slide, please. We move on to another controversial statement. Symphony concerts have become dull and predictable. Musicians and audiences are suffering from repetitive routines and formula-type programming. There's an acute shortage of conductors who not only know their scores inside out, but are inspiring leaders, and there is just as great a shortage of administrators who possess artistic vision and imagination, as well as fiscal responsibility and sharp negotiating skills. Next slide, please. Why the hell should anyone then contemplate an orchestral career? Why? Because with some measure of thoughtfulness and a large amount of goodwill on the part of musicians, managements, unions, boards of trustees, and government agencies, we can make life in orchestras truly stimulating and fulfilling for the musicians and richly rewarding for our audiences. Next slide. And here is what the person who said the last two slides worth of controversial things, Ernest Fleischman, who was then the CEO of the Los Angeles Philharmonic and one of the great orchestra managers of the 20th century, said, to achieve this, we need to shed some of the traditional accepted notions about the shape, the structure of orchestras, their schedules, their duties, and their repertoire. If we want to save that glorious instrument, that magnificent creation of Western culture, the symphony orchestra, we must accept that the orchestra as we know it is dead. Next slide. All of this is very cheery, wouldn't you say? But I always like to throw in some references to Ernest Fleischman and his thinking, as well as to pay tribute to composers and their thoughts on orchestras, courtesy of Gunther Schuller in that case, because I think it's important to say that there have been challenges with life and work in symphony orchestra organizations for a long time. This is not a purely Canadian phenomenon, may not even be a purely North American phenomenon. But my theory that I'm putting out today is that COVID-19 is either the worst thing that ever happened to orchestras and the way that they operate, or it could in fact be an opportunity for a radical rethink, a pressing of the reset button, and some opportunities moving forward. And we'll talk about that too. So moving on now to the question of COVID-19 and how it has affected orchestras, what opportunities it opens up and what doors it closes. Well, do I remember that middle week of March. Wednesday evening, the World Health Organization declared that we were in a pandemic situation. And starting on the 12th of March, Canadian orchestras began to get the word from public health authorities that gatherings of ever smaller sizes were forbidden. Groups that had concerts scheduled for Thursday, March 12th, were rapidly getting in touch with patrons and letting them know that those concerts wouldn't be happening. Orchestras that had been getting ready to perform for sold out houses were trying to figure out how to rapidly live stream to an empty hall and ideally a captivated audience from around the world. So we immediately saw a lot of cancellations, a lot of postponements, a lot of live streaming activity in the very short period of time when orchestras could still gather. And a sense that I've described this before as being somewhat of a snow day. Was that idea that, school was out, everything was stopped, there was nothing we could do about it, we had to manage it effectively, but presumably we'd be back sooner rather than later. I think what's now kicking in, and I describe these as midterm responses, is no one has performed a public concert as a full symphony orchestra in Canada since the middle of March. It simply hasn't happened. We've seen wonderful postage stamp sized performances from people's living rooms. We saw live streams, as I mentioned, that last weekend before the venue and before the venue closures took place. But we have not seen live performance as such. We are starting to see some things happening in the province of Quebec. I just got a media release this morning telling me that the Orchestre Métropolitain, with Yannick Nézet-Séguin conducting, would be doing all 8 of Beethoven's first symphonies. They're not doing 9 because no one's singing in a public place these days, but they will be doing all the first 8 Beethoven symphonies for an empty Salle Bourgie and live streaming to the world. We're also hearing stories of string quartets performing 6 feet apart, performing for people who are standing in their balconies listening. But we are not seeing big groups on stage performing for big groups in the audience. We're also seeing significant discussion about what the fate of the 2020-2021 season will be for orchestras across Canada. A couple of weeks ago, the Victoria Symphony announced that they, along with Pacific Opera Victoria and the Professional Ballet Company in Victoria, all 3 announced that they would not be proceeding with the seasons that they had on sale at that point. Just yesterday, the Edmonton Symphony, along with 3 other professional performing arts organizations in Edmonton, announced that the season that they had put on sale would not be happening. And although that we have not seen announcements from other orchestras across the country, we know that every one of them is operating with anywhere from 9 to 12 different scenarios about what next season is actually going to look like. But there is a lot of what now going on, and a lot of private calculation, a lot of scenarios being contemplated by management, musicians, boards of directors, and a lot of very careful communication as well with patrons about what might possibly happen. Let's go on to the next slide. So some of the things that we are absolutely seeing is that almost every orchestra has turned some aspect of its activities online. And whether it's living room concerts, whether it's engaging next season's soloists to perform mini concerts from their living room, whether it's how to scrape an oboe reed, whether it's digging deep into the digital archives and replaying things that have been pre-recorded in earlier seasons. We've seen all of it. And it really doesn't seem to matter what size the orchestra is. Pretty much everybody has pivoted to some form of digital offering. The big surprise for me, and I think for a number of other folks in this, is that I had assumed that with the presence of something like the Berlin Philharmonic's digital concert hall, that the need for a Canadian orchestra with much less funding and much less deep resources all around to actually have a lively performance presence in the digital space was probably not all that. They didn't need to do that. I opined. It turns out that in fact many of our orchestras are discovering that their patrons actually love them. They love the music, they admire the Berlin Philharmonic, but they actually want to hear from their musicians, their music director, and their team. So, this idea of going local and at a time when we are all at home, spending a lot of time glued to screens, we want to connect to the people that we know. So, that's been an interesting one. I'll also say that we have not at all cracked the nut of monetizing the content. Now, I see a question from Noah. Was the Berlin Philharmonic the first orchestra to perform since the lockdown? Great question. Noah, I do understand that the Berlin Philharmonic did do a socially distanced performance with a very small orchestra uh, early on in the opening up period in Germany. I will also say that it was somewhat controversial and possibly against the advice of their health officials in Berlin, but I think that they wanted to be able to demonstrate that it was possible to get the musicians into the hall, albeit a small number of them, space them appropriately on the stage, the Philharmonie, and move on. Again, um, that was really exciting to see. And I think one of the things that comes across loud and clear in all of these initiatives, whether it's the performances from your living room or uh, physically distanced musicians on stage at the Philharmonie in Berlin, is musicians want to play. And that comes across uh, with absolute clarity is their quality of life and their enjoyment is absolutely rooted in being able to play again. So I think Berlin might have been first, but we've also seen things from Prague. We've seen things from uh, parts of Asia, China in particular. There have been some efforts to return. We're also endeavoring to get in touch with some folks in Sweden, where the lockdown rules were much less tight, to find out how they've done. We also understand that the orchestra in Iceland, was performing for small audiences, even through the closures. So we've absolutely seen that. But digital has absolutely been a big element for those members of the audiences who've not been comfortable coming out, or where the space actually was not open for audiences to enter. What else are we seeing? We're seeing a major effort by orchestras to keep the friends that they had, to stay in close touch with patrons. I can think of at least 3 Canadian orchestras where musicians are making phone calls to donors and ticket buyers, just to check in on them, find out how they're doing, and ensure that they know that their orchestra cares. We're also seeing that with the plethora of free digital content, some orchestras are reaching out and connecting with people who never had purchased a ticket before. What this means in the long term, we don't know, but it is interesting to see, at least based on data coming out of the US yesterday, that the audience for online content by orchestras tends to be, it skews younger and it skews more culturally diverse than the standard folks that we see in the concert hall. Other things we're noting: major disruptions of the planning cycle. Orchestras, as you may know, are planning usually 2 or 3 years out in order to get the dates in the halls that they need, in order to get access to the guest artists they need, in order to be able to commission works and have them ready in time, and just to generally think about putting together a rich and balanced season. If they tour, they need to be thinking at least that far out in order to plan and resource those tours and ensure that they've got strong presenters in all the places where they're going. So COVID has basically thrown that out the window. The entire planning cycle has been disrupted in a pretty significant way. What we're seeing in terms of the kinds of conversations that are going on with Canadian orchestras right now is they are tending to adopt strategies that favor agility. So if your music director is in Amsterdam, and the likelihood of them getting into Canada, spending 14 days in quarantine, even if they can get a flight, and then being quarantined similarly when they head back home again. If that's where you sit, then maybe you're looking at hiring conductors who are actually present in Canada. Maybe you're looking at rejigging your arrangements with soloists and postponing international soloists and instead favoring local or at least Canadian soloists who you are reasonably confident can actually make it to your community in order to honor the performance date. We're also seeing orchestras that are saying maybe we don't bring in so many per service players. Maybe we work with our core of musicians to whom we have a strong commitment. We work with them and we look at chamber orchestra stuff. We look at chamber music. We look at what's the largest group we can possibly put together with physical distancing guidelines still in place. So there's just that whole thing of looking at the orchestra not as a single unitary and large multi-legged beast, but instead a group of extremely talented individuals who can work together in different combinations in order to serve their communities. The financial management aspect of this is also really tough. You'll remember before that I gave you some numbers around where Canadian orchestras get their money. So 76% of their annual income comes from ticket sales. Guess what? We've got no ticket sales right now. Another amount within that 76% comes from donations, sponsorships, and special fundraising events, which are often events that take place in person. Guess what? A lot of those things are currently in doubt. So that's a tough one. What does it look like when you're trying to run an orchestra on 30% of the revenue that you used to have? Government, the federal government in particular, has been really generous, but their support so far has been definitely focused on short term, helping to get people paid, helping to keep the lights on. But where there is no traditional work for orchestras to do as they have historically conceived of it, believe me, we're continuing. It's a major force of our advocacy work is trying to ensure that orchestras have got the resources that they need to keep on planning, keep on thinking, even though they can't operate business as usual. Another great question from Noah, and that is, do I think that most orchestras will have shorter concert seasons next year? Noah, I do. I think that most orchestras will have shorter concert seasons next year. I think that in many cases, medical officers of health in the communities will not permit the size of gathering that's necessary for an orchestra to put on a concert and have an audience of a big enough size for it not to be financially suicidal. So I think that while there may be some extraordinary nimble activity in the short run with small ensembles, chamber ensembles, and so forth, possibly use of untraditional venues in order that everyone can be spaced out as much as they need to be, I think that most orchestras at this point are acknowledging that the seasons that they had programmed and that many had put on sale in January and February of 2020 are not the seasons that their musicians will be performing and that their audiences will have a chance to enjoy. Certainly a few of the folks that I've talked to have used a construction metaphor and have said basically that they've taken a crane, they've attached it to the 2021 season, and they're moving it into 21-22. So to buy themselves the flexibility to reprogram as public health measures change. So it'll be different and it may be shorter. We'll see. The final point on this slide that I want to emphasize is around the role of musicians. And I think the thing that I've been most charmed and amazed by, charmed, not amazed because I knew it before, that some of the best content that we've seen online and some of the most personal communication has come from members of orchestras. I'm thinking about Jeffrey Beecher, principal bass player of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, who taught himself how to do video and sound editing on the fly and put together the TSO's recording of Appalachian Spring fairly early on in the pandemic. Just thinking about that kind of thing, which I've seen replicated right across the country, where musicians have stepped up to figure out ways of keeping the music going and contributing to a sense that this is a lively and vital part of life in the community, that the musicians care and that they're still hard at work, even though concerts, as we know them, can't happen. Next slide. So I've already talked about cancellations and postponements. I've already addressed the fact that orchestras are acknowledging that they don't have all the answers and they can't make all of the decisions. So they're putting together multiple scenarios for what next season might potentially look like. NOAA already pushed us into a little bit of an exploration of what the approaches to reopening are around the world. And again, this is a place where I can absolutely say that the timing of the pandemic and when COVID-19 arrived in Canada has at least given us the opportunity to take a look at how orchestras in other countries around the world are responding, orchestras who are resident in places where the virus hit earlier, and just to see what their comeback plans are. I will highlight absolutely the need for research to ensure a safe return for artists, arts workers, and audiences. We've all seen postings on Facebook of puffs of smoke and bassoon players and so forth. What we're now looking for is research that is rigorous, peer-reviewed, and can be replicated in a range of venues. So we're not just going on hope, we're going on good science. And so there are measures underway. I referenced something that OC is a small part of moving forward. And I think we're just going to continue to try to get access to the best science we can so that we can provide medical officers of health with that information and work with our members to get the doors open as soon as we can, but also as safely as we can. Next slide, please. So this is a really weird presentation because I started with, I think, just the facts, moved into some spicy observations about orchestras and how they do or don't work for the art, for the artists, and possibly even for the audiences. And then I rolled into the COVID thing. So I think I'd like to now move it over to you. And maybe Noah, you'll be the first to leap in, or possibly others on the line. If there are others on the line, can also join in. I find myself asking today, were orchestras broken before? Is this in fact as tragic as the deaths and the illness caused by COVID-19? Is there a little bit of a silver lining in terms of a chance to rethink what we want 21st century orchestras to be like in Canada? Or should, in fact, we be aiming for a return to the old normal? Not the new normal, but the way it used to be. And so this is my challenge for folks on the line, and whether they're NYOC staff or musicians. What do you think? What do you want to see from the orchestral life that excites you most? How do we make it right? How do we make it better for you? Those are my I don't have answers, but I sure have a lot of questions. Thank you very much. So silence is one of the hardest things that I know of in this kind of conversation, because I'm actually wondering where this has actually left you. And Chris, can I put you on the spot for a moment? You've been with NYOC for how long now?
2 and a bit years. This would have been my third summer. Well, this is my third summer. It would have been my third summer at Session on Tour. But yeah, two and a bit years now.
So I know that the National Youth Orchestra of Canada is doing a really good job of endeavoring to prepare musicians for the next kind of orchestral career. And before we go to Leo's question, can I sort of look at you and say, what are some of the things that you're proudest of in terms of the work that NYOC does to help create or help develop complete musicians and complete human beings?
Yeah, I think our session is a great example of offering chamber music one-on-one lesson time, and kind of the real world aspect of rehearsal, orchestral rehearsal, and going on the road and touring for the orchestras that do have the privilege of touring. Not every orchestra does. but I think we do really offer the full experience. But I think this online experience as well has kind of given us the opportunity to kind of show a new leadership and a new skill that musicians are developing, and that is how to go online, how to teach online, how to be savvy enough to promote yourself and partake and learn from online offerings, which I think is maybe a new skill that NYO is learning, and also showing that we can all learn this and be part of it together.
Yeah, I think that sort of collective, how are we going to do this, and how can we be generous with it, and how can we take the most we can from this time is really important.
Mhm.
So, great question coming up from Leo. Could the agility and variety of programming and delivery I alluded to as a feature of how orchestras are handling the current situation be something to continue going forward? I love this question more than I can say. Um, and I am really, so I want to say yes, or um, more equivocally, I want to say, why wouldn't we want to be more agile? What would, what do we lose by not necessarily planning our seasons 2 to 3 years out? Remember a number of years ago, Greg Sandow, who's a writer and thinker about classical music issues in the United States, suggested that maybe if orchestras and opera houses, particularly the big ones, abandoned um, multi-year planning cycles and endeavored to be a bit more responsive to what was hot in the world at the time, that they'd be better off, that their venues, their offerings would be more of a source of excitement and discussion in the popular culture, because you know the great new thing was actually happening, as opposed to the thing that we thought was a good idea 3 to 5 years ago and then discovered that it wasn't. I also think that um, and that's to do, I think, as much as anything else with repertoire and with soloists. I also think that the opportunities for small ensemble playing, for different leadership models in ensembles within the orchestra, are pretty exciting. Do you have to wait for the music director to come, or can you, as a group of colleagues, sort out your ways of working as chamber musicians? Does that lend uh, ensemble blend and potential to your Beethoven that was never there? Does it also enable you to get into performing spaces that you've never been in before? And I think it's my theory, uh, and I have some support and some pushback, to say that I think, I mean, there's nothing more glorious in my opinion, than a full symphony orchestra in full cry. That is a giant thrill, uh, but I need a mixed diet. I want and I need to hear different sizes of ensembles in different kinds of settings. And I see orchestras as a remarkable sort of assembly of assets, artistic assets, human assets, people who are quite remarkable, whether they're playing backstand second violin, they're somewhere in the viola section, they're playing bass trombone. Um, they're all interesting individuals. I want to hear more from them. I think that the sort of atomized approach to looking at the orchestra is a very exciting one, and just sort of thinking about what different combinations we could come up with. So, great question. Um, Okay, I've got a question from Charlie, asking me to opine how quickly I think vocal music like opera or choral concerts will come back. Now, Charlie, like everyone else I know, was completely horrified by a webinar that was put together by Chorus America, the National Association of Teachers of Singing, and a number of others, where they brought together a group of doctors and scientists to talk about transmission of the virus through singing. What a colleague of mine talks about, she refers to them as loud talkers and loud singers. That the um, what happens when we inhale, what happens when we sing with great intensity, is, that this whole scientific study around the dissemination of aerosols, those tiny droplets that we emit, seems to be pretty damning. And I understand that it's a combination not just of the intensity of the aerosols, but also the length of time of exposure. So I think that there needs to be better peer-reviewed and replicated research on how that's going to go. But at this point, it's not looking terribly cheerful. There have been some studies, I think, around how you place a choir so that they are not, how do I put it, disseminating aerosols at one another quite so directly. So the idea of a single line in a semicircle and people adequately spaced, that might work for a chamber choir in very particular settings. It's probably not going to work for the Toronto Mendelssohn Choir in the choir loft at Roy Thompson Hall. So fingers crossed that the research will tell us something different, but right now it's not looking terribly cheery. So I want to go back to, and so I'm sorry for that. I wish I could say something happier, but singing and declaiming of any kind seem to be quite the challenge. So I'm going to go back and have a look at a comment from Noah that orchestras could explore more online performance excerpts to advertise their programs. In that same vein, performing and rehearsing online is quite draining emotionally if it is done on a daily basis. So I'll address both observations there. I would agree with you that the desire to do a better job of conveying what it is that we're asking you to buy a ticket for, and by illustrating what it is that the orchestra sounds like, what it is that the sound world that the music occupies, I think that's something that is strongly desired. I'd say that one of the potential opportunities of COVID, and again, I don't want to downplay the tragedy that this is, but that there have been robust and flexible conversations with the Canadian Federation of Musicians about digital content capture and sharing at this period of time, because they know we can't sell tickets. The union has been quite flexible in terms of what can be done with recorded content. As for performing and rehearsing online, I'm right with you. It is soul-sucking and desperately hard. I think one of the things that we can hope for, Noah and others, is that we will soon have good enough science that musicians can rehearse together, but the dissemination might need to be all, they can rehearse in the same room at the same time, albeit physically distanced, but the audiences might need to be someplace else. So just a thought that there. Okay, an interesting observation from Leo. I think it's interesting that 100 years after audio recordings became available and 50 years after video recordings became available, the live orchestra experience hasn't changed in a way that provides something that those mediums can't. Perhaps this crisis will force orchestras to reckon with that reality. And, I've heard people suggest that this is a crisis that will be solved through imagination. And if the sort of protocols around bringing people back into the concert hall remain challenging for the next little bit, we are going to have to be incredibly creative about how it is that we make it a thrill to come back into the hall. And I think we're also going to need to deal with the fact that different people have different opinions about what they see as being innately thrilling, whether it's the silent sort of cathedral of music experience when you go, you close your eyes and you just lose yourself in the sonic sumptuousness of a symphony orchestra, or whether you need something that is more visually engaging, something that has been designed and directed from top to bottom. So, everything from how does the orchestra enter? Is that a moment, or is it some people kind of shambling out, chatting amongst themselves and playing their excerpts before the concert starts? Is it a designed experience, or is it not? And so I think that there's a lot of work that we could be doing on that one as we consider what it is to bring people back in. Lucy has raised a point, wondering if reduced international travel could encourage Canadian orchestras to focus more on hiring musicians within their own communities. I believe that particularly in this period of time of experimentation, that's absolutely what's going to be happening. Um, that first of all, it's the simple practicalities dealing with quarantine, dealing with um, closed borders, that kind of thing, and the possibility that our move from the current, stage one or wherever we're in and whatever jurisdiction you're in to being fully open, it may not be a straightforward route. Um, we could go from stage two back to stage one, depending on what the process of the virus is. So my suspicion is that a lot of folks are looking really closely at how to ensure that whatever it is that they are offering is something that they can confidently move forward with. And I think that that's potentially a fantastic opportunity for Canadians. So great observation, Lucy. Thank you very much for that. So I'm seeing Delia's putting a call out to many of, I think, her peers on the phone in terms of solutions to challenges as classically trained musicians. That Delia's mind has been churning over things ever since the shutdown. Delia, I'd love to hear more about this. Is this a conversation that NYOC can help facilitate amongst the group of musicians, or how that might unfold? But I think that several things. First of all, I feel really strongly that the music is worth it. The music is worth the pain and the sacrifice and all the time that you are spending in practice rooms and all the time that you're spending dreaming and focusing on honing your crafts as performers. I do believe that, and not just because I'm paid to believe that. That's this has been my life for a really long time. But I also think that if the way that we are doing it isn't working, possibly wasn't working before, definitely isn't working right now, and may not work as we start to come out of this, we need you. We need a blast of commitment and imagination and creativity, allied with absolute practicality about getting the numbers to work. And that's what I'm thinking. I don't think this is a time for hanging on to, my job is to do this, my job is to play higher, louder, and faster, and your job is to count the beans, or I'm not sure that kind of segmentation of whose job it is to reimagine a symphony orchestra. I don't think we can trust that somebody else is going to take care of that. And I think if COVID has taught me anything, it's that our orchestras are filled with brilliant, caring, gifted human beings on stage, backstage, in the office, on the board of directors, and also in the community. And that the solutions that emerge are likely going to be local rather than laid down from on high. They will be highly responsive to communities. And that's, I think, where the hope for vitality and a long life for the music lives.
We'll give it maybe another 10 seconds here for any questions to kind of come through. There is a bit of a latency, so we'll kind of see if anything else comes through. And feel free, Catherine, by the way, to add any last comments by all means.
Sure. I think I talk to a lot of people every day about where this is going and what we do next. And I think I can confirm absolutely that there is no one answer. But I do believe that there will be a series of answers. And we may be surprised at where the best answers come from. I'm actually excited for the potential of this time, even as I recognize the many, many challenges that it brings forward. They're artistic challenges, they're financial challenges, they're challenges of purpose. Um, and yet I am blown away by the resilience and the creativity of the people I'm talking to, whether they're management, board, musicians, uh, or music directors.
Mhm.
So, it'll be one of those things where if I were to watch this in a year, I might be mortified at some of the things I said, but I'm prepared to be excited
Mhm.
about what we do with the opportunity that and how we face down the challenge that this time represents.
Amazing. Well, Catherine, I think I'll say thank you very much for that very poignant yet inspirational discussion that you had with us today. There's certainly a lot of food for thought and a lot to take and unpack. So thank you for being here with us today and kind of giving us a perspective on Canada, but also a kind of global scale. So thank you very much.
My complete pleasure. Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks to everyone on the NYOC team. And congratulations to the musicians who would have been part of this year's orchestra. I can't wait to hear you next year. Thank you.
Thank you.